So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview, broadcast and recorded live on blogtalkradio.com from the new media and baseball capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. Artist Joe Kubert's lines are among the most distinctive in the comic book profession, not in the least because there are so many of them. Kubert's work is intensely detailed and stylized, whether he's drawing Sergeant Rock from the World War II era or Tor from 1 million years BC. Fans can spot his product from 10 paces away, the same way that Jack Kirby, Will Eisner, Jim Lee, Frank Miller, or any number of others stand out like quality beacons from the newsstand shelves. In his new, richly researched book, Man of Rock, a biography of Joe Kubert, author Bill Schelly takes a long overdue look at the life and career of one of the comic book industry's most enduring, successful, and beloved icons. Bill, welcome to Mr. Media.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Delighted to have you here. Congratulations on the book.
Well, thank you. It's been a project that I've been working on for the last 4 years, and it's certainly nice to see it finally get published.
I bet. That's a long time. Listen, you don't need me to tell you this, but folks listening, take it from someone who has been down this path. You don't undertake the biography of a comic book artist because it's going to make you rich. What was your motivation, Bill, to track the long and distinguished career of Joe Kubert?
Well, I write biographies, and my field of expertise is the history of comic books. So I guess when you look at that history, there's one man who's been doing it since the very beginning, and that's Joe Kubert. You know, he's been working in comics since he was 11 years old in 1938, and he's been done just about everything. He's worked for just about every company. So writing about him was not just writing about him, but it's really writing about the history of comics.
How much did Joe participate or cooperate in the work?
Well, I did go out and visit him at his School of Cartooning in Dover, New Jersey, and he allowed me to go around and observe people working in the classrooms, and I did interview him. But it's entirely my book. He didn't. I don't believe he ever read it, has even read it to this day, because he finds it so embarrassing that there's a book about him. I mean, he said I could write. As far as he was concerned, he didn't even need to read it because he had faith in me as a writer. He'd read some of my earlier works, and finally, you know, he never did read it.
Wow. Even now.
Right. Well, I mean, maybe since he's got his copy.
But he didn't have. Did you even give him the opportunity to read it before press?
I certainly did. In fact, he said he would. But I think ultimately Joe just really is trying to husband his time. I mean, after all, he's now 82. And, you know, so he wants to focus on the things that he enjoys the most, which are his family and his work. And reading about his life, well, he's lived it.
Well, yeah. I can see that, but you know, there's also some concern. Especially, I think guys of that era have to, you know, be a little wary of, you know, even someone they know telling their story. I mean, details get turned or misinterpreted. That's a guy who's very self-assured, I guess, that he didn't feel he had to worry about it, and obviously he had a lot of faith in you.
Well, he had read my book on Otto Binder, and in fact, that's the only reason he cooperated with me, because he said that he liked it so much that he felt I would do a good job. He didn't. It was really all my idea and my project. However, I should add that his wife Muriel did read a first draft of the manuscript before, unfortunately, her untimely passing. So she had read it, and you know, she would have pointed out anything alarming to Joe.
Yeah. So how much time did you actually spend with Joe, all told?
Well, I was out at the school for a couple of days, and he gave me all the time. He invited me to his home, where I interviewed his wife, and he allowed me to go down into his basement studio and dig around. That's where I found his old drawing board he got when he was 11. He still has it. And then later, you know, I did call him up and ask for clarification and some further questions over the phone as I was working on the manuscript. So he made himself available to me, but mostly it was during the visit when I went back there.
Huh. Did you call him by phone? Did you do other interviews?
Right, exactly. I would call him, and he gave me his number to get right through to him, and he was always just very pleasant, always, sure, what do you need, Bill? What do you want? Totally cooperative and friendly.
Mm. And you interviewed other people, obviously.
Right. I mean, I interviewed people that have never been interviewed about Joe. People like Bob Bean, who is his best friend really in his life, who he met when he was in the military in the early 50s. And Bob went on to draw comics and then went on to be a movie director. And also his family members, like his sister Roz, for details of their childhood. And many, many comics professionals. People like, John Severin, Russ Heath, and people you would associate with Joe Kubert.
Mm. I know from doing this kind of work, the thing that I'm always pleased by, it's always nice when you can talk to the subject, but it's also interesting when you reach out to people who've known him or her for years, or their perspective is a little different, and sometimes they remember stories that the person you're writing about doesn't. And so you get you get that 360 degrees around the person that really fleshes out, I always think, the entire story.
Well, that's right. And in fact, you should be careful as a biographer, well, you know this, Bob, that you don't just take one person's version of things, but you try to get multiple sources of information about events and things like that. And fortunately, quite a few of the people that have been in comics from the 40s were still around. Some of them are now gone, even in the time I worked on it. So I was able to get different points of view on things, as well as some unique stories.
Hmm. And what about Joe's boys, who both followed him into the profession, Adam and Andy? Did you interview them? Did you spend much time with them? And what was their feeling about Dad being lionized in a biography?
Well, I had a very interesting talk with Adam when I was back at the school, because his studio was in the school, and went down and talked to him, and we really reached a very quick rapport and I think trust level, because he could tell what the book meant to me and what Joe had meant to me, and that I was really sincere about trying to do a good book. But he did say this. He said, a lot of people will be looking at this book. And I just kind of went, I guess that means that it's people, Joe is important in the field, very important. And his family will be reading every word of it. And so a lot of people are going to be reading it very carefully, I guess, is basically what he was saying. And, of course, I didn't shy away from that.
So basically he's saying, so don't screw it up, Bill.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And I should add that I also did talk to Andy and actually later Adam over the phone and did interviews with both of them.
What kind of things did you hear from them? I'm sure if I ever warranted a biography and someone came and interviewed my daughter, they'd hear some very different stories than they might hear from me or grown-ups around me. What did Adam and Andy add to the story?
Well, of course, mainly I was focusing on how they got into the field of comics, which is pretty unlikely considering it's such a difficult field that two of Joe's sons would end up becoming premier artists in the field and really want to do it and love it and thrive with it. But they did point out that Joe was very active in their lives in their Boy Scout den and school sports, and he drew programs for school things that they were working on, and definitely wasn't remote and was very involved in their family life, regularly and all that. And of course, he worked at home for years. So, but at the same time, Andy pointed out that they knew that when Joe was behind closed doors working on comics, that it was a serious matter, and that they realized and grew up knowing that this was work. It wasn't play. Drawing comic books might sound like fun, but in reality, it's work. And they knew that even going into, getting into drawing comics, they knew it would be work. And also, Andy pointed out that when he first went to the school, he had no idea of becoming a comic book artist. He just wanted to learn about the school so he could work in the administrative side of it. And he was really hopeless when he started there. And he said if it wasn't for his father saying, you can do it, you're improving, because at a certain point Andy realized he wanted to do it, Joe really kept him from quitting, because Andy really had to go a long way to get where he was. And, of course, now he's a superb artist.
Mm-hmm.
And so his father believed in him, and I don't think any of the instructors at the school did.
Really?
Yeah.
Now, that would be, that's got to be a tough situation. To follow your dad's footsteps, and not only that, but he also teaches it. It's not just, my dad's an auto mechanic, and I'm going to go hang around the garage and learn how to be an auto mechanic. No, my dad is an auto mechanic, and then he teaches over at the college everyone else how to become an auto mechanic. And yeah, that would be a tough situation.
Well, I think it's true of any child, of anybody who has a parent who's a star, who's really famous, or a star, or a leading light in the field they're in. And they both seem to be pretty nonchalant about it. When I talked to them, neither one of them would acknowledge that it was a problem or had intimidated them or anything. They just said, "Well, we know we're not Dad. Could never be him, and we just wanted to do our own thing." And so they never would say that they were abashed by it.
Well, while we're still talking about Kubert family members, you got to spend some time with Muriel before she passed. I was thinking about Blake Bell's book about the women behind comic book icons. I Have to Live with This Guy. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about Joe Kubert's wife, or late wife, Muriel, and what she may have added to the story? Well,
a couple things. First of all, she was very involved in the establishment of the Kubert School. Mm-hmm. She and Joe really set it up just by themselves. I said, "Well, you must have had some help." She said, "No, I don't remember anybody helping." And so, she was the one that had to go out and, buy material for their dorm spaces, had to go out and buy equipment, had to set up the accreditation with the state of New Jersey, which was a huge task, I guess. But she's a college graduate. She was a college graduate and a very smart lady, and she was able to do this. And Joe could focus on looking for instructors and getting the space, buying the building for the school and that sort of thing. But she was very involved in that. And then also later with his graphic novel, Facts from Sarajevo, she was the one that organized all these faxes that they had received from their friend Irvin in Sarajevo, who was trapped there during the siege in the early 90s. And I guess they became aware of it because his only mode of communication was fax out of there. And then later, when Joe was thinking, this would make a good graphic novel to show the world about this, they had hundreds and hundreds of faxes, letters, articles, and she really was essential to pulling all that together and getting it organized. And then Joe went on, the Facts from Sarajevo went on to win all these awards and become one of the crowning points of his career. Mm-hmm. So she was a big part of that.
It's good to have a spouse who's as much a partner as someone who you just go home to at night.
Well, she always thought that the field was fascinating, but so she was never put off by it when she first met Joe. And then, of course, she became very used to the fact that wherever he went, he carried a sketchbook and would be drawing. So she would always have a book that she could read at the ready, so that if he became engrossed in drawing a cathedral or something when they were in Europe, she could kind of take a seat and read her book, because she just knew that Joe had to draw.
Right. Well, folks, if you've got a question for Bill Schelly, author of Man of Rock, a biography of Joe Kubert, you can give us a call, 646-595-3135. If you're in the live web chat that accompanies the live radio show, you can ask a question there if you like. A lot of people, sometimes they're at work, they can't call in. They're listening, they got their headphones on, but we can take questions that way too. For people who may be listening who are not familiar, who may know Joe's work but are not familiar with the school, could you give us kind of a short description of the what the school does and kind of its evolution over the years?
Sure. Well, drawing comic books is a very specialized skill. It's something that isn't well understood by a lot of people, and drawing comics is more than being able to draw a superhero. It's just drawing stories in sequential art form. And Joe had noticed that a lot of people really weren't getting the storytelling down as well as they were just drawing the individual figures. And he was concerned about that, and there's no place a kid could go if they wanted to draw comics to learn about it. Really, they were on their own. So in about 1976, which is when the school started, he established it, and students started coming from around the world. And basically what they would do is they would be lectured perhaps in the morning on different subjects by some of the instructors. Sometimes they had seminars, but generally they had ongoing instructors. And then in the afternoon, a lot of the time was spent drawing. I mean, they basically spend a lot of time drawing, as a comic book artist would. And if you can't cut that, then you can't be a comic book artist. So the school really gives people a solid foundation in what it takes to really be successful in that field.
And how has it grown over the years? I mean, how has it evolved?
Well, it started in a big old house in Dover called the Baker Mansion, and which was part for dorm space, part administrative, and classrooms all in one big old house. It's since moved in the early 80s to the old Dover High School, which Joe purchased. And so it's in this huge, really beautiful, old, historic edifice, and he has more room than he needs. But he also has in there a store that sells supplies, and he has another place where he produces commercial art projects. And so the school has, become bigger and so forth. I don't know that the number of students has changed, and please don't ask me how many he has, because I don't really know. I honestly, in thinking about it, I don't really know. But, it's not like there are hundreds and hundreds of students that come for each new year. It's probably, under 100 each year. There's time for even Joe. People can come to Joe, and they can even talk to him. Even now, he's available to them. So he's never become that remote or anything.
Who are some of the better-known artists that have come through the school and gone on to work in the industry?
Well, let's see. Of course, there's his sons, who are absolutely at the top of their game at DC Comics, drawing their DC's top heroes, Batman, Superman, and so forth, and then before that, X-Men at Marvel. But there are a lot of others. There's Tom Mandrake, Steve Bissett, Rick Veitch, John Totleben, a lot of people who are really highly regarded for the quality of their work, and are now almost themselves senior experts. It's been going so long, they're now in their 50s or whatever, and there's a whole new crop that have come up. So there are just an awful lot of them. And I don't know too many of the new ones because I'm not as familiar with the younger comic book artists. Okay.
Well, let's go in a different direction. A guy whose career goes back to 1938, 39, 1940, thereabouts. We're talking 60, 70 years of history to work with. Was there a period? Two questions, actually. Is there a particular period of his career and his life that was most interesting to you? And then is there a particular period where he actually disappeared from view for a little bit, where maybe less is known, and that was particularly interesting to learn about?
Well, for me, one of the most interesting things about writing the book was trying to piece together his early career, because until he did Hawkman in the late 40s, or mid to late 40s, the earlier years had been talked about a lot, but the dates, the companies, and so forth hadn't really been pinned down. So one of my biggest challenges was to try to figure out exactly, who he worked for when, and how he came up from being an 11-year-old to getting his first chance to assist other artists, to getting his first chance to do his own independent strips, to finally getting to work for the top company in the field. To me, that was not as well known as you might think. It was just a lot of anecdotes that had been thrown around. And so I tried to pull that into shape, and I found that very interesting. I think one of the most interesting periods of his career was his period when he was working for St. John in the early 50s, because he was instrumental in the creation of 3D comics. And the whole story about how the comic book craze for 3D comics happened, his involvement in it, right in the center of it, and then how it collapsed and everything, and how he picked up the pieces from there, I think is just fascinating. And then later, of course, how he got to do Tarzan for DC is also, I think, one of the high points of his career, and very interesting. But he has worked consistently. Like he told me one time, he's always had a job every day of his life. He's never been out of work ever.
It's interesting. I have a quote from Kubert when I interviewed him for the Will Eisner biography. I wanted to share this. I was thinking about it as I was getting ready to talk to you today. He was talking about he got paid $12.50 a week working for in Eisner's studio early on. I guess he was 11, 12 years old, and his basic job was to erase pencil marks and to clean up pages. So if you don't mind, I just want to read you this. It's not very long. He says, "I remember a cover that Chuck Quidera did. It was a good example of the work done at that time. Black Hawk was climbing down a hemp rope, and there was a spotlight circle behind him. I got this on a 13 by 18 board. I started whiting out the whole thing, and I got involved in the rope. I was putting more hair in it, taking it out. When the drawing was done, I was putting in more lines, taking out other lines. And when I finished, Chuck looked at it and said, 'All you're supposed to do is erase and clean. Don't draw on my stuff.'" He says he wasn't mean, but he wanted to make it clear he didn't want anyone to change or alter his drawing once he was done with it. That was, to me, was the most memorable thing that I got out of Joe. And I always remember that. It just was a very funny little slice of life.
Well, sure. And, he was a very, let's face it, at that age, he was very, very young and callow and didn't have a clue in many respects about things.
Yeah, who would?
Right, who would? So he did a lot of dumb things, I'm sure. People would give him advice he would ignore. People who, were even when he worked for Sheldon Mayer, Joe had kind of a thick skull, as young people will, and it took him a while to really for things to sink in that Mayer was telling him that he ought to consider in his work, because he just felt he knew better, as, like I said, a lot of teenagers do.
I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, he, like Jack Kirby, maybe a little less than Kirby, had a reputation. He could be a bit of a tough guy, and he didn't take any guff from anyone. He was bigger than Kirby, I know. He is bigger than Kirby.
Yeah.
But had a bit of a reputation for being, I don't take any crap from anybody.
Right. Well, that's a very consistent theme through his whole working life. Sheldon Mayer was legendary for his temper and for flinging pages around and for being angry and upset with various artists and temper tantrums. But he never did it with Joe, and Joe was really still a teenager. So even then, there was something about him that people felt that if they did that to him, he would just walk away, and he would have. And I think that it's very difficult to figure out how people knew this. Or, Joe was so confident as an individual, but even as a youth, that people would not want to do that. And then later he worked for Bob Kanigher, who was legendary for the same thing, being kind of actually abusive to artists and berating them and so forth. But never with Joe. At least Joe never acknowledged to me that ever happened to any degree at all with Bob. I mean, he said it didn't. So, and then later, Bern Hogarth said, Joe Kubert's kind of an angry guy to someone. And I asked Joe. I just sat across the table. I said, "Joe, are you an angry man? Or do you have a temper? Do you have a bad temper?" I mean, he said, "No, I don't think so." And He said, no. He just looked at me, and I believed him. I just, I can't imagine him really losing it. I think it's just that incredible confidence, and he knows that he will be okay if he has to walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
that's a great way to go through life.
If you can do that, and few people can. I mean, I think some people were intimidated by it, and some of the kids at his school were intimidated by it. But it's not because of anything Joe does to make himself intimidating. That someone that confident is a little unnerving sometimes.
Well, somebody who works for themselves, as he really has most of his life, you have to have, and you know this, I mean, you have to have that kind of confidence to be able to wake up in the morning and get through a day when you don't know where that next check may come from.
Well, exactly, and his father was that way. His father, at 50 years old, decided he wasn't going to have a butcher shop anymore. He was going to be a welder. I mean, he just had confidence that he was going to make a change, and I think Joe said that he would have, if he had to, he would have dug ditches, but he wasn't going to take, being abused by any editor and so forth. And I think he's had pretty good relationships all the way through, probably because of this, with all the different people he's worked with. Jim Shooter, who also was purported to have something of a temper, he never had any problem with Jim Shooter when he was working with him. So it just seems to be something that has run through his life.
One of the parallels I picked up, this kind of follows that thought, I think, in your book, was that Kubert, like his old friend Will Eisner, handled his business affairs quite well from the beginning, even though Kubert, unlike Eisner, worked often within the traditional comic book system and did not necessarily own what he created.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, he like many other, everybody in the comic book field, except, maybe some of the moguls, like Eisner was kind of a mogul, received a piece, did piecework. He received a dollar amount for a certain page, and that was it. He had no rights to it. If he invented a character, he had no rights to that character. Mm-hmm. And yet, somehow, unlike so many other comics professionals who ended up in kind of hard times in their later years, Joe isn't. I mean, he's well off. He's successful, and you have to figure there's something special about him because of that somehow he took the same thing. He was paid the same amounts in a lot of cases, but yet he came out so much better. So I think he didn't have a business sense to him.
Early in the book, when you're talking about his early days working in the 40s, for example, he does very well. He goes out and he buys the Town and Country cruiser. I mean, he's got a big new car, and he's getting on. I mean, it just seems like he started from that point of strength, and he never went back. Part of it, I think, it came out of his family, because ultimately it was his mother that bought the car.
Right. But, of course, she only put in the down payment, and even the down payment was probably from money Joe earned, because he gave everything he was earning while he was living at home to his mother, who kept all the family money and then would dole it out. Right. And so it was a matriarchal situation. So he always had what he needed while he was living there. He said he never even wrote a check until he got married, and which was in the early 50s. So he always, you're right. I mean, but his family was poor. I mean, they grew up poor immigrants in New York. It's not like they came from any money. I mean, they were dirt poor.
But he seemed to, he handled it. I'm remembering talking to, and I apologize, I can't think of her first name, Harvey Kurtzman's widow, and she was talking about how Harvey was terrible with money and terrible with business deals, and he would do things on a handshake because he honored the handshake, but the people he did not always honor the handshake, and so he would go to he would get business advice from Eisner, and he'd shake his head in agreement, and then he'd do pretty much the opposite of whatever Will told him. And I'm thinking that in the case of Kubert, he made out so much better than his contemporaries for decade after decade. There had to be guys that he knew who looked at him and say, whose wives? Let's be honest here. The wives probably looked at Muriel and Joe and said, "Okay, he does the same thing that you do. Why is it that we have no money and he's living in a nice house and his kids have got nice clothes on? It's just I guess some people are just better at it, understand this, understand the situation better. I mean, even to this day, I'm sure that there are plenty of comic book creators, artists and writers, who make the same amount of money, and it's just like the rest of us. Some wind up with money in the bank and will make it through a rough patch, and others are just always looking for that next handout.
Exactly. Well, of course, Joe always says that he's the luckiest man in the world, but I don't believe that has been luck at all for him. He's had his share of bad luck too, but yeah, and you have to remember also that comic book artists a lot of them really are creative souls, and creative people by nature, I think, are not always the most practical people, and are not always the most on top of things like financial planning and so forth. They're in the creative process, and somehow Joe is able to straddle both.
In researching the book, was there anything that comes to mind where there was certain things that you went into it believing were true about Joe or his history or his work that in researching them and tracking them down turned out not to be true?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, being a longtime comic book fan and historian, I've been pretty familiar with Joe's career. Well, of course, I didn't realize how much he was involved in the formation of 3D comics and so forth, but in general, it wasn't so much that I found things that I was surprised by. It's that I began to have a deeper and deeper understanding of Joe as a person, his family, and of course all of his relatives who stayed in Europe, living in a Jewish village in the Ukraine, well, it was then southern Poland, were wiped out by the Nazis. And so I guess in one sense that was the big surprise, as I began to understand what it was like to be Jewish in the 40s in America and have and then that experience of the Holocaust as it filtered through Joe's life ended up becoming having all kinds of echoes throughout his career, and not just the Holocaust type graphic novels that he's done in recent years, but even a gradual kind of darkening of his artistic patina, if you will, in the early 60s, late 50s and early 60s. There came into his work a darker quality, and so I theorize that to some degree it was a mature man's awareness of the dark side of life and human nature that ultimately derived from the fact that the Holocaust had wiped out much of the Kubert family. So I guess that side of it was something that was kind of unexpected because I'd never given it much thought until I got into it more deeply.
I'm thinking that to put in this kind of time and energy, 4 years, and you topped me because I only put in 3 years on the Eisner book.
Well, let me cut in and say that the book took me about a year and a half to 2 years to write, but the research before that took a year, and then I'm also including the fact that it was finished about a year ago, and there was all the finishing work to get the book out and the proofing and everything. So, it wasn't just 4 years of having to write it. It was 4 years from the idea to it being out.
What I was going to say is, I appreciate you clarifying that, is you must have some favorites among Kubert's body of work.
Oh, absolutely. I just really am a big fan of Sergeant Rock and his work on Sergeant Rock, and of course that's where the title of the book, Man of Rock, ties in. And also the rock, a metaphor for Joe being steady as a rock through his life and so forth. But Sergeant Rock, I think, is what I find to be the most compelling, because the idea of someone, Rock is someone who goes through life, in this case the war, trying to solve problems and deal with situations that are a little more realistic than superheroes. And I almost find that relevant in my own life. trying to, assess the lay of the land, figure out the best course and how to deal with issues and problems, I think really is there in Sergeant Rock. So somehow that has a particular fascination for me. But of course, I love his work on Tarzan also, and I think that's absolutely superb. In fact, he's the only one, or the only one who's done a complete graphic story adaptation of the first Tarzan novel that has really been successful. Others have been either too short or truncated or whatever, but Joe's the only one who's really done. It's about 80 pages long, which is enough to cover just about all the major things that happen in the first Tarzan novel. So he has a unique contribution to the Edgar Rice Burroughs mythos.
Yeah, I don't think as a teenager, and that would put me in the early 70s, I think, that I would have read and then dug up Our Army at War, the Sergeant Rock comics, or the Tarzan comics that he did. That I don't think I would have read them if some other artist had worked on them. They were just there was something so special about the way he draws. I'm not I don't watch a lot of World War II movies. I'm not a military guy. I'm not I think my wife likes Tarzan more than I do. But I remember reading all those comics. Of course, at the time you could pick them up for 10 cents 12 cents, whatever it was, 15 cents. But
right.
You could afford to buy big stacks of comics in the early 70s as opposed to now when it's like $3, $4, $5. But I read all those and absolutely remember, how distinctive the look of a Kubert drawn comic was.
Yeah. And I have to say that this is just my personal opinion, that as good as the other artists that have drawn Sergeant Rock, it just isn't Sergeant Rock if it isn't drawn by Joe Kubert. That's my opinion. I really don't have a lot of interest in the other strips, as good as Russ Heath is and some of the others, George Evans and so forth. And it's actually the same way with Tarzan for me. Imagine, as good as Bert Hogarth and Hal Foster and Russ Manning and some really top people have done Tarzan, but somehow it's Joe's work on Tarzan that is special and really gets me like none of the other artists do.
Which part of Joe's legacy do you think is more important to him? His comics work, his son's work, or his school?
Good question. First I have to say that I don't think Joe's concerned at all about his legacy. I don't think he thinks about that at all. I think where Joe lives his life is at the drawing board, solving storytelling problems and so forth. I think he's content to let others figure out what his legacy is. I think to him, probably the school, it would be the thing that he's proudest of, because after all, it's an amazing thing that he's been able to make this thing go since 1976, and think of the influence he has had in those people's lives and in the whole field of comic books because of all the people that have come out of that school. His influence is far more than what he has done personally. But I don't think Joe thinks a lot about his legacy. Personally, I think his legacy will be primarily with the work he did for DC in the 60s on Sergeant Rock and Tarzan, and then I think also the school will always be a key part of it.
It's interesting in reading the book. You learn that the school was not the first effort that Joe made to teach. He had started something much earlier, but like back in the 50s, wasn't it?
That's right.
Can you tell folks a little about that?
Sure. Joe, the thing is, Joe was, when he was a boy, he would go around to comic book artists who were working in offices in downtown Manhattan, and they would let him watch, and they would let him ask questions, and they would essentially teach him things that he needed to know to be a comic book artist. And they were always very kind to him, and he really appreciated that. Well, gradually this this thing, he began to realize as he got to be a mature man that there was no place that someone could go to get this information, and so he started with the idea of a correspondence course, and that was in 1952, I think 1953, with his friend and lifelong friend Norman Maurer, who was working with him at St. John, and they created a course that, and it was going to be 12 different parts, 12 different lessons, but the first lesson was created and is available, exists. But then there was the big comic book crash, and St. John went out of business, and the whole thing kind of got scuttled because of that. And so the correspondence course never, came to fruition other than part one. And but I think in the back of his mind, he was always thinking about it, and so finally, somehow it all clicked later when he was, in his 40s, and that's when he decided to start the school. But I've never been able to quite understand what it was at that moment, that precise moment of time, that caused him to do it, at that time. Except that Harry Chesler came back into his life then, and Harry had been his first sponsor, so to speak, when he was 11 years old. He worked for Chesler. And so when Harry Chesler came back into his life in the 70s, they ran into each other. I think it reminded him of all those days when he was young and wanted to have a place to learn how to draw comics. And that may have had something to do with it, him, forming the school in 76.
And you mentioned Norman Maurer, and I'm glad you did, because I looked back over my notes and I realized I wanted to ask you about what I found to be a very fascinating part of Joe's life. Was his involvement, of all things, this guy who's got all these very serious credentials, whether it be Facts from Sarajevo or Yossel or Sergeant Rock, Tarzan. He brought the Three Stooges to comic books.
That's right.
That just seems, I've only spoken to Joe once, and what I've read of him, I mean, he doesn't seem the most jocular guy, like he's not not a lot of descriptions of him being a guy who tells jokes or is particularly funny, or
right.
But tell us about the Three Stooges. How did that come about?
Oh, sure. Well, the thing is, you're right about Joe. I mean, I think he has a sense of humor, and he's greatly appreciates joking and laughing around with his friends. But there aren't too many people that get that close to him. However, Norman Maurer and Joe went to school together as boys at the High School of Music and Art in New York, and Norman's style was always a semi-comic style. He could draw serious comic book art, but his stuff, and he did in the 40s on things like Daredevil for Lev Gleason, but he also could draw very humorous things. And later, in the late 40s, he married the daughter of one of the Three Stooges. Norman Maurer married Joan Howard, who was Moe's daughter. So automatically he had a connection to the Three Stooges, and so when Joe invited Norman to be part of the St. John publishing effort, that was very natural for Joe to ask Norm if he could get the rights to the Three Stooges comic book, because humorous comic books like that have always existed, but I don't think Joe ever drew any of it. It was always Norman.
I see.
Yeah, so the connection. However, Joe did meet Three Stooges when he went out to Norman's wedding in California in 1947.
Right.
So he did meet them. Yeah.
Very interesting stuff. And of course this all dovetailed with 3D comics, which again, not a place you might have now looking back expected to find Joe Kubert, but he was right there. At the birth and the unexpected death of 3D comics.
That's right. In fact, the birth of 3D comics, talk about funny comics, was a Mickey Mouse comic book. And he and Norman adapted it, and some other people took it and as an experiment basically adapted it to this 3D method that they had developed and to see if it would work, and they published it, and it sold like 1 million copies, and he basically got the down payment on his first house from that Mickey Mouse comic book.
Mm. Right, and and that was another good point where he fell into money, and he did the right thing with it. And of course, it's a great approach. If nothing else, even if you're not that interested in Joe Kubert, reading the story about what happened with 3D comics is just, to me, that was fascinating. That'd be a great excerpt from the book, or it'd be worth buying the book just for that, because I just thought it was so interesting. And St. John, buying up all the supplies, he had a 6-month window on the patent or the to do for this particular process, and he bought up all the supplies to try to keep everyone out of the business for that 6 months while he cemented his case, and then the whole 3D thing collapsed.
And St. John had these railroad cars full of acetate and paper and all this stuff. Oh man, what a debacle it was! It was really amazing. But see, St. John was always looking for something where he could break through and make a windfall. He was always looking for something that where he could really make it big, and so he was seduced by the amount of money they made on that first Mickey Mouse comic book, 3D comic book, and so when he saw that, he just saw dollar signs, and I think, and ultimately, it led to a financial debacle. Although his publishing did continue after his death I think he died in 1955. His son continued it with things like Manhunt and Nugget and things. So his publishing company didn't exactly declare bankruptcy, but it was a pretty big disaster.
It's a story well told in there. I enjoyed that. I thought that was very interesting.
Well, Bob, I wrote the book. I should say I wrote the book so you don't have to be a comic book expert or even a rabid comic book fan or anything. I wrote it so someone can enter the story and appreciate the story of Joe's life, just as almost like a novel. And so if you're interested in popular culture, if a person is interested in comics to a slight degree, the book will not intimidate that person with a lot of details about comics and a lot of facts and things that go on and on beyond their point of endurance. It's really for to kind of bridge between a more general audience and then your dyed-in-the-wool comic book fan. I tried to find a balance.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, you would definitely, someone who's not into comics who gets past the cover could find a lot to be interested in. Obviously, the cover is Sergeant Rock staring up at Joe Kubert, so it's comic book oriented. Well, as we kind of wind down here, just want to ask you, Bill, what's next for you? Have you started on another comics project or something else?
Well, my other hat that I wear is as a historian of comic book fandom itself. My book on that, The Golden Age of Comic Fandom, was nominated for an Eisner Award and all that, and then I've done several other books along those lines. Well, now my kind of capper is I'm doing a book called The Founders of Comic Fandom, which is a book of about anywhere from 80 to 100 biographies of the founding people and the most important and movers and shakers in comic book fandom at the very beginning, from the late 50s and EC fandom, and then in the 60s with superhero fans and so forth. A book of biographies with a photo of each person and that kind of thing. So that is going to be published by McFarland probably in 2010. I mean, I'm just writing it now. But as far as biographies and things like that, I'm open to suggestions. I really don't know what I will do next along those lines.
McFarland published my first book many years ago.
Right. I mean, I don't think there's a huge audience for a book on the founders of comic fandom, but I think it will give those people credit for what they did, and for a lot of people who don't really get the recognition. And these were very important people, because without them, the whole formation of fandom and everything would have probably happened, but it would have been very likely quite different. So we had some people that really loved comic books, and they were not just kids. They were high school, college, and beyond, a college professor, that kind of thing. And So, I always want to give those people tremendous credit because of what they did just out of the love of comics. Not for money. It was all done just out of love.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly appreciate that. As a guy who was very involved, here comes the geek side, very involved in comics fandom in the mid-'70s.
Oh, yeah?
We had the Fans of Central Jersey. We had about 500-600 members. We did the newsletter thing. We put on conventions. Yeah, I've got that. What do you think? I just start asking these questions about comic books because come on, I got to have roots somewhere.
Yeah, you don't write a book on Will Eisner unless you love comics also. And you did a terrific job on yours.
Well, thank you for mentioning. I had promised myself I was only going to try to bring it up once. So thank you for bringing it up.
It's called A Spirited Life, and I would recommend it. I think Bob did a fine job.
Thank you. And that brings us to this. Folks, you can find Bill Schelly's new book, Man of Rock, A Biography of Joe Kubert, at great bookstores everywhere or online from Amazon.com or mrmedia.com. That's MrMedia.com. Fun book, very interesting to read, and fills in the gaps on yet another great artist in comics who's been around, done great work, and this is the thing. When we started talking, I said that you don't do a book like this just because you don't do it because you think you're going to get rich at it, because there's not that kind of market. But it's a really well written book. It reads very well. There's stuff in it that will surprise you, like the 3D stuff, the Three Stooges stuff, and then there's just other. It's just very interesting.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Sure.
I appreciate the comments because it was done out of love. I'm not going to get rich on it.
I had a feeling I was right about that. Yeah, I'm pretty confident about how that works, unfortunately. But folks, do him a favor: go out and buy a copy of his book. And Bill, thanks so much for joining us at Mr. Media today. I appreciate your time and wish you much luck with the book.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Take care of yourself.
Sure.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. And folks, for dozens more comic book creator interviews, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com. That's where you can listen to my earlier conversations with Gene Colan, Darwin Cook, Wendy Peeney, Joe Sinnott, Chuck Dixon, and even comic book historian David Haydu. And please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, Digital Journal, Podcast Pickle, Vox, Folio, Mediafly, Podfeed.net, Blueberry, Zencast, Odeo, the Amazon Kindle Reader, or iTunes. And if you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@Andelman, that's ANDELMAN.com. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate when you give up a little piece of your day to spend it with us. Come back real soon. Bye-bye.